I'm not really like doing much with the YouTube channel anymore. Um, but I'm sort of I still like I don't know. I kind of like to record things sometimes just because like you never know if you get something decent and then you well,
Yeah,
but
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
so okay, first of all, like how far along is your wife? Like when is baby coming?
March 25th is the due date. So
Okay.
she's, yeah, kind of moving towards the third trimester here.
Yeah, nice. Okay. Nice. And you know it's a girl.
Yeah, yep.
Do you guys have a name picked out yet? Or you just
I think we're gonna go with Raina.
oh nice.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's
The
beautiful.
Be the Rayna
Okay.
spelling.
Why? What's the significance there?
Well, so um, my wife is Norwegian, and I'm mainly English and Irish, and so that spelling is like more comes from the Scandinavian side. And the middle name I think we're going to go with is Bell, so it'll be Raina Bell, which would mean beautiful song, because
Oh,
Raina means
nice.
song in Scandinavia. So we really like that.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's kind of the main gist of it. But
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
yeah,
I know you sort of started this with like you want to hear some of my perspective of the journey with bringing the children along, but I also like I'm curious to hear like you mentioned it's sort of like you're going through that reorientation a little bit of like,
mm,
whoa, this is different. Like, what have been a
yeah,
couple things that you've noticed with that?
yeah. Well, I think one of the things that has been, I think, more fascinating is to watch my wife go through it, and then that reorientation, then reorienting me by like another layer out. Um, my wife, uh, has historically struggled with a lot of anxiety
Mm,
and difficulties with trauma and stuff like that.
mm,
And um, for a while, the thought of having a child was kind of overwhelming to her for some of those complicated reasons.
totally.
But she eventually reached a point where like she really made that choice of her own, and it like there was she felt like it was time, and it was this kind of like really clear thing that she
Mm,
arrived at. Um, and one of the things that she's noticed is since being pregnant, a lot of her anxiety has really gone away.
really
Um,
interesting.
and not to mention, I mean, there's obviously a lot of reasons to be anxious about, all this stuff. So that's kind of what's really like startling is she so much of the peripheral things that kind of like vie for attention and like all these different directions you can go to were all of a sudden snapped into focus. So that like pyramid of attention and everything like that was like given to her
Yeah, yeah.
rather than it be something you kind of like trying to navigate within the wilderness.
Yeah, man.
Um, and the way in which that's kind of oriented her during this season it's been really like wonderful to see from my perspective. And I
That's
think it's
cool.
had an effect on me, but just watching her go through the process, because it really is quite a mysterious process of like at all levels.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
that's been the main way it's been affecting me.
Man, I remember that so well because like my wife and I had for really like a year, maybe 2 years, graduating up levels before she got pregnant with our daughter. We would, like every night, we would sit on the couch for like 2 hours after we ate dinner. We'd eat dinner, clean up dinner, and we'd just sit on the couch and just talk. And
Yeah.
a lot of it was sort of Dialogos type. Like we were running all over the place, doing all kinds of stuff, and
Right. Right.
it was awesome. We were having so much fun, and I remember like there was a very clear point. It was like probably I think she was about 8 to 10 weeks pregnant or so when all of a sudden she just lost all interest. Like she just couldn't. I mean, it wasn't that she wasn't interested anymore. It was like she no longer, like you're saying, she no longer was interested in bouncing around to
Yeah.
peripheral things. It was like, no, all I care about is learning about childbirth and how to raise a child,
Yeah.
and like I just don't care about anything else. And
Yep.
I think it didn't take me too long to sort of like understand that and be okay with that. Although it was hard because I had enjoyed all that time so much. But it took me a long time. It was my daughter was like 9 months old by the time I realized that it didn't make sense for me to just keep running without her. Because that's sort of what happened, right? Like for a while, it's not like she stopped her journey, but she just
Right,
sort of
right.
settled down where she was. And I just continued to, I mean, this was sort of in uh, the time we actually met in Chino was toward the
Yeah,
end
right.
was toward the end of this time, right? And I was going hard on the YouTube channel and
Yeah, yeah.
having all these wonderful conversations and reading, books on books on books and just um
Right.
and what ended up happening was there was a bit of a gap that opened between us
Mm.
because I still, like I would be excited about these things and try to tell her about them and bring her into conversation. And she was just like, it was just sort of exhausting for her.
Yeah, yeah.
And that just, that began to, thankfully it didn't really cause us problems in a sort
Mm.
of like straightforward material sense or
Right.
even arguments or anything like that. It just became obvious that, um, yeah, that I needed to shift in that way too.
Mm.
So that was
Yeah, yeah.
that was a big thing for me.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think there's a sense in which it's like, at least how it sounds similar to how it was with your wife. Like there there was like a furthering in like the Lewis sense, right? Like there was this furthering in from which the embodiment of those things became clear. And I think what some of what you were saying, I think really sheds a lot of light on somewhat of the nature of men and women to begin with, in that the women have this embodiment that is so intricately linked to their existence in the world, and the that invitation that offers the man to enter in, as it sounds that you've had to, like,
Yeah.
but then at the same time knowing that there exists this space to, still have one hand reaching out to heaven,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but also another hand cultivating the earth.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah.
this hierarchy and how it exists is, yeah, it's almost as if the pregnancy, like the initial fruit of a marriage, begins that process of truly, like the beginning of a family, begins that process of everyone beginning to play their role in their divine order,
Yeah.
in a way that
Mhm.
before that there's a sense of like everyone's still kind of jockeying for positions, like, I mean,
Yeah.
it's all happening just organically, but there's a lot of experimentation. But as soon as the conception happens, it's like, it's almost, the conception is the beginning of the real, in some like weird mysterious sense. Obviously I'm talking at different levels here, but like,
Yeah.
that's a profound experience.
Yeah, man. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and the like there's something so clarifying about it. You know, that idea of freedom as being something that you're free insofar as you have a very clear good to which you are connected.
Right,
And
free to something as opposed to free from something.
exactly, right? And
Yeah, yeah.
there's something about having children that makes you so free
Mm.
because you don't have to ask the question, what would be good for me to do right now? You know,
Right.
there might be things, it's not as if there still aren't times that it's like, okay, maybe I do need to do something besides just spend time with my children, right?
Of course, right.
But that always is a good thing.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah,
you
yeah,
have some things that are very clearly like, this is a good thing I can be doing right now.
yeah.
And I mean it's challenging because it does take over your life, right? Like, but it's also, I mean, for me, it has been so okay, let me back up. Like one of the difficulties I've had and continue to have is finding a finding something in the material world to which I can completely devote my loyalty, right?
Mm.
Um, I have found that I can devote my loyalty wholly to the person of Jesus Christ. But what that means in the material world depends on who
Right.
you're talking to, right? And
Of
so I'm
course. Right.
still askance
Hence the
from
problem.
right. I'm still
Yeah.
askance from any church establishment,
Right. Right.
um, because of that. But now with children, and before that with my wife, there's always sort of the ability that you can sink into serving people. But with children, it's like I can completely sink my teeth into
Mm.
a loyalty that's very clear. It's very concrete. It's very, like that. Schindler told me one time there, he was quoting Eric Pearl, that Eric Pearl had told him, the most philosophical thing you'll ever do is change your baby's diaper. And
Yeah.
I like, that is like a keystone for me. And I
Mm.
think about it every single time I change a diaper, which is great because I
Yeah.
change a lot of diapers. And
Yeah. Yeah.
but but there's something so profound about that has been tremendously good for me
Mm.
looking back on the last couple of years, right? Because I have two now. I have my daughter's, she's just a little over 2 years old, and then I have my son is 7. Oh, he'll be 8 months here shortly.
Mm.
And so, like, our life is pretty much taken over by
Yeah. No, that's in the thick of it.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. But um, but yeah, it's so funny, because our culture is very much, that there's very much this sense of if you're having children, you're sort of giving up your life.
Right. Right.
And I remember my mom, I'm one of 9 children, right? So
That's right. Yeah.
my
I remember you
mom,
mentioned that.
yeah, my mom spent most of her life raising us, and she was a stay-at-home mom, and there was a time early on, shortly after our daughter was born, that I said, thank you for doing that great sacrifice.
Yeah.
And she was almost a little bit offended, and she said, Kenny, it wasn't a sacrifice. Like, that is the greatest privilege of my life. Like, don't act,
Mm.
don't paint me like a martyr here. And you know, first, like, there's a good impact on me, but the more I have, it's given me like one of those really good sort of like guiding lights. And my mom's not a perfect person, and she certainly wasn't a perfect mother, but at least in this sense, I think she did a really good job of giving me a sort of guiding light to follow,
Mm.
because it is easy to sink into a sort of self-pity, right? Like the sort of
Yeah.
self-pity
Yeah.
that Lewis does such a good job of pointing out
Dismantling.
ourselves.
Yes. Yes. Right. Right.
Um, of like, oh, okay, gosh, you know, I can't do this, or I can't do that, or I've got to do this, or like, oh gosh, my back hurts because I've been, bending over holding my son's hand so he can walk because
Yeah.
that's all he wants to do, right?
Right. Right.
And having a place to aim for of like, okay, don't make this a sacrifice, because what the hell else would you rather be doing?
Mm. Yeah. 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 No, well, that's 100% the case. And I think, well, there's a few things that you said that really stood out to me. I mean, I think, first of all, that idea that it takes a sort of level of epistemic humility to know the appropriate level from which you can act in the world in terms of like service and embodiment. And so like when you were mentioning like this idea of like following Christ and like what does that mean in the world? What does that mean in this embodied way? There's a manner by which the church or the participation in the church in the kind of the physical sense is almost it's almost too high of a participation, at least to some extent, and for many people. And so there's something about the
Hmm.
the beautiful family that presents a context, a home
Hmm.
that has enough intimacy to it where it can appropriate all of those desires and hold all those things in a way that I do believe in some cosmic way that the church is the vision of that for the whole world.
Yeah.
But it's too far ahead of itself in some ways, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. And that's a very interesting conversation. I mean, thinking about that in terms of all views about the church and everything. But at the very least, the church is something like a it's it's always like yeah, it's like too far ahead of its it's like moving towards something, but because it tries to move towards something in a way that doesn't embrace the supremacy of something like the family or the marriage. And of course, it does that in its sacraments and it tries to focus on that. But at the end of the day, it's not presented as that way. It's the church that's the glorious, and to some extent, you have to do that because you have to hold the aim higher than where you are in reality,
Yeah, yeah,
or you lose sense of where you're going. But if you, but then that also comes with the problem of then the means by which you achieve that aim then becomes degraded, and then you can't direct yourself towards it either. It's a
yeah,
perennial problem.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and so, I mean, that yeah, that idea that you have found that in working with your kids and spending time with your family, and that's beautiful, and that's like one of the things that's been coming up for me, especially within like even the last year or two, is maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, as getting into all this, kind of stuff and everything. It's like there, there's a really strong spirit to it. And I know you felt it too, and stuff like this kind of sense of like, you kind of are struck with all these profound insights about the nature of reality. And
yeah.
there's this real like captivating spirit of like, all right, I need to go save the world,
Oh gosh.
like, and that's it's very infectious, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
something dawned on me maybe a year or two ago, and I started to feel it and live it more out. Is that like I don't need to do that and don't even want to do that as much anymore, and that like I whatever participation I have in whatever that is cosmically, that involves something very trite from the
Yeah.
perspective of the world, or from that perspective,
Yeah.
in the idea that like I am a continuation of something of thousands of generations before me who were
Yeah.
trying to grapple with the greatest of things, let's say,
Yeah.
and that they gave all of that unto me. That's something I inherited, whether it be through my parents and my grandparents, but also the books that I read in the world. And I've inherited this, and that
Yeah.
my participation is to offer perhaps even a crumb or even a morsel to my children, but not just my literal children, but to the children after me, that may orient them towards what's most highest, and that I don't have to capture that or something like in a vase and give it to them.
Yeah.
And that's been such a profound, but
Yeah.
it's a very powerful insight. And when you were bringing up freedom, that's really what, like, that realization in my life that has kind of been on the fore for me this last year has freed me
Yeah.
in very interesting ways.
Oh man. Oh yeah. Absolutely. I think that there's there's series of traps on the path. And one of the great ones, I think, is that once you're really going on the path and you really start to get some fancy tools and you really start your eyes really start to open. One of the last great traps is the trap of evangelism. Like it and it is a great trap because it's such a and I I've suffered with that trap a lot because I fell into it, fairly significantly. Um, but having children definitely helped me a lot to come back out of it. And it's funny, because it's like I knew pretty well that it was a trap, but I continued to fall in it.
Mm,
Because
yeah,
there's something and I think it is a good impulse, like you go run across something that's good and you know it's good because it actually made your life better.
right.
And unless you're a sort of miserly person by nature, you're going to try to share it with people. But it's easy to try to give people things they don't think they need. And
Yeah,
it's also really dangerous to give people fancy tools when they don't know how to use them.
yeah, right, right.
It's
Very
like
misunderstood
don't
truth.
give a
Very
chainsaw to a
misunderstood.
4-year-old. Like
Yep.
Like, great, you can clear a huge forest. That's awesome. 4-year-old's gonna cut his leg off. Like, don't do
Yeah. Yeah.
that.
Right. It's too high for them.
It is, exactly, exactly. And that doesn't mean that
And
you're better because you can have it. It just means that you don't, and I've had to learn it I've learned it in some really painful ways because I have on a few occasions shed light on things for people that they weren't ready to see. And
mm,
I thought it was going to make things better, and it made things much worse.
I've
And
definitely had that same experience. Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
man. Yeah. And
And you
so,
feel horrible because then you watch it playing out and then you realize I didn't understand that higher thing contextually. Like I may have understood it in its seed, but to
yeah,
only understand something in its seed is actually to not understand it at all.
absolutely. Yeah, it's like typically how it happens is like I see someone who's stuck in a pattern here, and I
Right.
can see it from up here. And so I can point out that, like, well, so this pattern that you think is the pattern you're in is actually just part of this larger pattern. And then it's like you show someone that, but if they're actually not able to, if they aren't able to actually pop up above, then they take the power that you've given them to see this larger
Yeah.
pattern and they take it down to where they
Yes.
still are because, they're still stuck in some, resentment or, sin, for lack of a better word, without, don't take that too far, but basically that's what it is, right?
No, no, no. Yeah.
And that higher power of seeing actually gets vectored into a negative cycle and makes it worse.
Yeah. It contributes to the idolatry in some sense because and that's what makes this so complicated is like one of the things that can be so frustrating is, if you do feel that you're at this higher level and you see people playing at the lower level that you were talking about, to you, their participation, or at least this is how I experience it, it sounds like somewhat similar for you, is that participation, because it can't see what's above it, does appear from our perspective like a type of idolatry,
Hmm.
because it's believing that that thing is the highest level when you
Hmm.
know that it's not. And so that's in some sense definitionally related to this idea of idolatry.
Hmm.
But what seems like you were pointing out, and I agree with you, is that there's something mystically beautiful about reality, and I think the manner by which the Christian story unfolds is that through the idolatry
Hmm.
there's something. It's very even hard to put
Hmm.
into words, but if you try to mess with the idolatry in this type of mechanized way of top down control, then first of all it you maybe weren't as high as you thought you were, because there's a sense in which you thought you don't understand how the lower levels are actually supporting higher levels. It's very easy when you're on a higher level to see how you're supporting them.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's the classic, like that's the one that's obvious.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you don't understand the way these people below you are actually secretly your crown. They're
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
your glory. It's the low things that are the crown. It's like the low is secretly the high.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But there's something also like eschatological about that too, because the hierarchy does exist in the manner we see it in the world, but all the glory will be lifted up, and kind of all the death, all the things at the bottom will create a certain type of crown. And that, I think, recognizing that mystery, even if you can't kind of understand it in this mechanical way, is part is part of seeing how to break free of that impulse of the evangelism in the way that you're talking about. So yeah, no, I think that's spot on.
Well, and I think it's very similar to, to make it very concrete, the the raising of a child, because, like, for example, my son, he's 7 months old, almost 8 months. He just started, like, really truly crawling this week.
Mm.
And he's, starting to pull himself up on things, and he can kind of, he can stand and he can walk if you're holding his hands, right? And he loves that. And,
Mm.
he's exploring the world, and he's falling down and bumping his head and, all these sorts of things. And there's a balance. There's a really dynamic and alive balance that you have to strike between helping raise him up and letting him fall. Because
Mm,
if you always raise him up and don't let him fall, he doesn't get any better in himself. He doesn't actually go on a journey that way.
right.
And if you just always let him fall, he gets stuck and frustrated and maybe will actually hurt himself,
Yeah.
in a way that's genuinely damaging, right? Because 98% of the time he falls, it doesn't matter, right? Like nothing bad
Yeah.
really happens, right? He'll cry a little bit, but he's fine.
Yeah.
But,
Right.
there is that 1 or 2% of the time where like he might actually get hurt.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think we sort of innate that's like sort of an obvious thing that we innately understand with children. But it is true at every level, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is the thing about it is like don't try to help people too much. Like Ramdas, the way Ramdas, I think as Ramdas says it is don't rob people of their suffering.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And it's not there's a way that this could sound really this whole conversation or this aspect of the conversation could seem pretentious, but it's just a way of saying like we're all on journeys and we all can see things about each other's journey better than we can see our own journey and
Mm,
at different points, right? But
yep.
it's really important that you don't think that you're outside of the journey space. You
Yes.
can
Yeah.
speak into
Well,
someone
that's
else's
huge,
journey,
right? The
right?
view from nowhere, we talk about like in metaphysical, like talking about the whole materialism thing, but then we don't apply that idea to the very thing that when we're talking about that idea. Like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it's to talk about anyone that talks about the pattern or a pattern is in themselves a part of the pattern. So
Mm-hmm.
there's no escape from that problem that you as soon as you find that higher third perspective from which you were stuck in these kind of opposing things, right? You transcended, you turned the tree of the knowledge of good and bad into a tree of life. But that new tree of life in this world is now another part of the duality at the next level up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's really the idea that if you're not humble to that fact,
Mm-hmm.
that's something like a meta sin that is as much as you continue to move up, you're not moving up in the proper manner, and so it ends up becoming a type of like kind of I don't know, like an addictive delusion because
Well, this
it
is how you
feels
fall into magic,
yes, yes, exactly, yep, yep.
I
That
think.
is the core of what magic is.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah,
You get high, you get power, and then you turn it in on yourself.
right, 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 right.
And
Yeah,
that's, again, another place where children, like the having of children, the having of a family, and like you said, the humility to recognize that if there is something great done through my life, it will be in spite of my best efforts to be a nobody,
right.
not because of my best efforts to do something great.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Right? Like I that is something that has, I mean, that's a simple way of understanding why I like don't really do my YouTube channel anymore, or at least not in the way that I
Mm,
was. And
right,
it's not because there was anything bad about what was happening. It was just that I
right.
realized that there was far too much of that spirit at work in me,
Yeah. Mm,
and that at least for the level of strength I had to navigate it at the time, that was too much for me.
mm. Yeah, and I think that's interesting because I think in this whole like whatever however you want to call it, this movement of it's continuing to gain traction in these online spaces and stuff is that you see that infection in the manner that we're talking about taking place with people who are very interested, and then there becomes, if your philosophy is to talk about the delusion of tribalism, the way that you're most blind is to understand how that can become a tribalism, because this is also why it can be so difficult to go to church because they'll talk about problems but because they've chosen to put themselves on a moral high ground about talking about those problems, that becomes the very place to stand where they become most blind to them at the next level.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when you intentionally don't take up that mantle, which in the same way that we were talking about at these different levels,
Mm-hmm.
you gain a level of perspective by not trying to take the perspective for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's very paradoxical. So it's completely understandable why. And again, I'm not to throw shade on people. I mean, I've participated too. It's like
Mm-hmm.
it's very complex because it looks like I'm offering you the thing, right? The thing to avoid the problem. But it's like if you understood the problem, you know that that thing to avoid the problem has the meta problem still at the next level, and that takes a level of understanding that it's not a solution in the way that we understand it. You can't be offered a solution to life like that.
Yeah.
And as soon as people
Yeah.
continue to, and that's it's bothered me most in the church because I think it's the when it happens at these lower levels, it bothers me because it's still the case with the pattern, but it's taking that at the highest level in
Yeah.
something like the image of Christ and then doing that too with him.
Yeah.
And if you do that with the highest version of how we know that there isn't a solution in some, in the mechanical technical sense, then you have no because you've done that with the highest image, you now no longer have an image that you can self-correct and understand that you can't do that with. Does that make
Right.
sense? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
so it's the most important that that never becomes what the church does with it, because that's the last line of helping you see it at the higher levels. Sorry, that was some high level language. Did that make sense? Like,
Totally. No, no, yeah, exactly. I know, I totally get it. And I think, I mean, we, for me, a lot of this goes to the temptations of Christ in the desert, right? Like those are paradigmatic for me in general, but especially, I mean, I think like those are the keys to get you out of yourself. I think those are the three keys to the three levels of individualism that allow you to break out of the prison of trying to be yourself. And the third one is like the first two are hard, but they're relatively doable. But the third one is a real trick because the the urge to do something that you think is good because you think it's good is very, very difficult for those of us who have enough of the urge to do what's good to go on the journey in the first place.
yeah,
Like, yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, in that's yeah. I think there's there's a sense also in which if you and this was something I around the time of Chino that was really like present for me, and that I was talking to with some people even there about it. This idea that like, and this really can be a baffling idea for a lot of Christians I know, but this notion, and I get that when I say it in words, it kind of doesn't come out well because it's just some of the confines of language. But this idea that in order for Christianity to be Christianity, it has to also die to itself, because that's the whole thing. So
Yeah.
that if you don't understand that, then it isn't. You see, it's like this weird paradox where the whole message is about the dying of self, but then there's this blind spot about seeing how that's actually the form itself is that as well.
Hmm.
And that's a real stumbling block for people.
Hmm.
And it's no wonder, because it's like if you digest that, it's like, well, then what now? Like, what the hell? You know what I mean? Like, that's a real like, but it provides that emptying for something then to fill it. It's something that's completely out of your. It's a complete giving up of control, a complete kenosis.
Hmm.
so that, yeah, I mean, I think about some of the ideas in the Nishitani's Religion and Nothingness
Mhm.
about that, about how when you've actually gone to the bottom, and how so much of all the, he talks about how, like, Nietzsche and even some of these brilliant thinkers, how they don't even take their own ideas, they don't take it to that last step. They aren't able to see it from its own perspective. And that when you do that, it's like, well, then it's just silence, it's just darkness, it's blackness, and it's nothing. So it seems like, well, that can't be it. And then you keep trying to figure out the place, but it's like, it's only when it's all gone
Yeah.
that now, and that's the miracle, because it's at that point you can't explain anything, and then all of a sudden, from the nothingness, something springs up. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like, but then you need to understand that process. It's such the Western mind. And it's like,
Yeah.
that's the part you can't understand. And that's the
Yeah.
part that you always have to return to.
Yeah.
And it seems as though there's, I can't exactly figure it out yet, and maybe I will by having a child, but there seems to be that idea that I was just talking about seems to be connected to having a child. And I don't know, it
Absolutely.
hasn't clicked for me exactly, but
Well, it's insane. I mean, like the sense of, and I every time I think about it, it sort of drops you into that space of aporia. The sense that when I look at my daughter, let's say, right, she's 2 years old now, we can have conversations. Sorry, excuse me. And I look at her and I just think about the fact that 3 years ago, she literally was nothing, like at all. Like there was nothing of Ember. I mean, maybe if you believe in souls somewhere else, I don't know, but like, you
right,
know
right.
what I mean? But like, I don't know anything what to do with that. So like
Yeah, right. It's
from,
almost irrelevant.
exactly, it's an irrelevant question, but like there was nothing of Ember, but now there's maybe nothing more important in the world to me than her, and she's so there, like she's
Yeah,
so real, like she
right.
is incredibly real, and I do think that is a genuine mystery. And in the process by which, she went from nothing into something is, I mean it's like you can point to places on the process and you can do sort of a biological like
Yeah.
like exploration of how that works, but at the same time it's like it doesn't really.
Doesn't account for the phenomenology of it.
No, not at all.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
And I think that's one of the things, that sense that we are completely in and connected and dependent on the world, but that we are also radically separate from it is so strange when you really come face to face with it. But I think when you come to that place where you realize the way in which you are radically with all things and radically apart from all things, you find that same space, like that same space where it's a genuine mystery of being and non-being, and it just doesn't make any sense. Like
Yeah, right, exactly.
it just doesn't make any, like you can't sense make it.
Right, right. It's why God doesn't try to Job. It's like, it's not
Right.
because that would be God doing the thing that you were talking about in the beginning, about the idea of trying to give an answer for someone who's on a lower level, and it would actually end up to his fall. And because God doesn't do that, he doesn't take the bait, so to speak, from Job. I mean, of course he doesn't, but like, he's able to offer Job. It's through not giving Job the answer he wanted that provides the answer for Job, but in this
Yep.
kind of non-being type of way, where then
Hmm.
Job sees it, even though he sees nothing exactly. Like, he
Hmm.
can't,
Hmm.
he could never explain what he sees, and that's presented in the story as like the resurrection of Job's narrative, and
Yep.
that is the mystery, and that this idea that, like, if Christianity is the answer, and that we find within Christianity this idea that there's something like, I mean, that the Peugeot brothers would talk that there's this identity and that there's a remainder, that there always has to be something on the edge, and
Yeah.
that is intrinsic to reality. Is that if you are if you are ever pointing to Christianity as the answer, then that also has to be true of Christianity.
Yep.
That the Christianity that you're pointing to, if you can point to it at all, you're pointing to the identity, because you
Yep.
can't point to non-identity.
Yep.
But then you just because Christianity talks about identity and then the edge doesn't mean that also isn't true for Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think I definitely have struggled with. I've started to come better to terms kind of with what I was talking about earlier about, and how that's been a process for me individually, of being less frustrated about watching that play out in other people, but largely because I can still see it in myself. So like that's also been part of it. It's like I'm doing it too. So what like and that when you start to see it in yourself, you you're driven to a type of silence, but not a silence that's like a drawing away from the world. It's not like that. It's a type of silence that almost stimulates a greater level of service to the people and to the love. Because you're not coming in with the answer, you're actually coming in with a complete giving up of your identity. It's not providing them an identity. And that's a mystery. I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah, it sounds to me like the sort of thing where, like, when you encounter someone who's really in intense suffering, like the worst thing you can do is say something.
Yeah, right, right,
Like,
right.
just don't, just be there. Just be there with
Yeah,
them.
yeah, yeah,
Serve them in very simple ways.
yeah, yeah.
And if they
Yeah,
want to
you're
talk, listen, but just don't say anything.
yeah, you're creating a space. That feminine ability to create a space as opposed to provide an answer is and
But,
and that I think is. Oh yeah, go ahead.
well, I just, like, I think that is the right way to approach. It's the right answer to the impulse of, well, I've learned this new thing. Now let me go save the world. It's like, okay, great. You know how you do that? You go and you hold space for someone, a particular someone who's actually suffering,
Yeah,
or maybe not. Maybe they're just your friend. Like, just be there with them.
yeah, right.
And if that tool is needed, it will come into play. And if it's not, you shouldn't use it. Like,
Yeah, yeah, right, right. Because it'll call itself forth of its own accord
yeah.
if it's the right moment and it's in the right time. Like, and we've watched that process take place, and we know intuitively, because we've lived in the world, that when that happens, we know that's the best manner by which it
Oh,
happens. And
absolutely.
and you kind of just watch there from the sidelines, like, how the heck did that happen? Like,
Yeah.
but you're drawn into it, and then you learn more too. You're not even providing. It ends up becoming a type of answer for both the person you're providing space for and yourself, which is a
Yep.
really cool part of it. And
Yep.
I think as we do that as individuals, like you pointed, like there's a manner by which the church, which is the feminine in some cosmic sense, has lost sense of that role in the world to
Mm,
create space for the world.
mm.
Like, she is that go she has the seed, right? Like, she was the mother of God who held the seed that came from heaven in mystery. And it says that Mary held these things in her heart, but she didn't
Yeah.
share about them.
Yeah.
And then she creates space
Yeah.
for Christ but then that idea that gets extended to the church as an imitation of her. And it remains to be seen how well the church has been doing that. I mean, is
Yeah.
creating the space for the world for the magic of that space to kind of happen. Not magic in the sense that we were referring to
Yeah.
before,
Yeah. Yeah.
something like a sacred magic as opposed to a technical magic.
Right. Right.
Um, and but then and I had that insight maybe a few years ago, and I was overcome with frustration, because it's like, but out of a love for the church, of course. But then too, I had to see it at my own level and realize that I too have. So for me, especially this last year, has actually been about trying to understand how to create space for the church, which is kind of ironic, and that I can't help to renew the church if I'm trying to take this masculine approach of trying to reform the church. But if I can create space for her because I love her and I do believe that there is this cosmic vision, then what that looks like is not trying to control it. It's so
Yeah.
cool to watch the levels play out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So where do you find yourself in relation to church now?
Yeah, I mean, um, well, funny enough, I actually did go this morning. Um,
You did or didn't?
yeah, yeah. I my grandparents, this is still in my hometown where I became a Christian when I was like in the teenage years. So say
Okay.
my church my wife and I met at. And yeah, I mean I've sometimes I've gone to the like an Orthodox liturgy before, and there's a manner in which I really crave the participation and the the movement towards something, and I crave the like there's very few places now that have a representation of the ordinary people of the population.
Mm,
Like maybe like one of the only other places I see this is like the grocery store, and we go to
yeah.
like kind of a very normal grocery store, and it's like this is the people, like like you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
they're in all their different forms, all the different types are there because it's like, well, everyone needs food, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's a really powerful experience. Like being in a grocery store is like really sacred in a really
Yeah.
weird way,
Yeah.
and there's a manner by which, because a lot of the manners of our participation now are like siphoned out to different types,
Yeah.
there's a lack of universality there, and there feels like a hollowness in that when you participate because it's not beckoning towards how everything's going to come together.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Even if
Yeah.
it's in its imperfection, which of course church and grocery stores are, but at least seeing that and being a part of that there's just people on the edge and people in the identity is, and at least beckoning towards something is transformative. I don't want to say transformative enough, but I think you know what I mean for
Yeah.
that. For
Yeah.
for me to be a part of it and feel as though, I don't I never want to feel so pretentious that I guess part of navigating it is I never want to stand outside of it. If I do choose to stand outside of it, it for me, it feels like it must come from a love for it rather than a pitying of it or a feeling like I'm above it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's what I fear most of all, that
Mm,
I know that my heart may be prone to. Does that make
yeah.
sense?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that may or may not involve in me actually participating. Like that's
Right.
complicated again,
Right.
but that notion and being able to discern my own heart in terms of what's orienting me is of importance.
Yeah. Totally. Oh yeah, man. Yeah. I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I've noticed, I mean, I've never not wanted to go to church,
Yeah.
right? But there's there's a deep concern about becoming overly identified with whatever church I am a part of, and yeah, just getting, you know, losing losing the capacity to be within and without,
Mm.
right? I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
I think that's the thing that I that's one way to say or gesture towards a much bigger sense of how I feel and why I'm so like I have a deep sort of skittishness within myself
Mm.
around
Yeah.
around church, right? Like I've come to terms, I think, more or less with a recognition that I don't think I can be a Protestant.
Mm.
Like I just can't. It just doesn't work for me. Like
Right, right,
I can't see past the theological and really philosophical more than anything, like philosophical differences of what the words mean and what we're even doing here. Like I just can't.
right,
We've gone to a Protestant church a few times, and generally, I just have to leave like halfway through the sermon because I'm like, I just can't do this. Like this is not.
right. Yeah, yeah,
And so, I think we're probably as close now as we've ever been to um, at least attend an Orthodox church because I think Orthodox is probably where what feels the most viable from the outside for me,
mm,
for us.
yeah,
And so I think we're about as close as we've ever been to at least, attending regularly and sort of just seeing how it goes.
yeah,
Um, but, to go back, I think this was one of the original points you brought up. It's like, I think my children have played a really significant part in that.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
because I don't know, I would, it's not that I don't want to go for myself, but the sense that I want my children to understand that the sort of thing that I am trying to gesture them towards is not something just of my own.
or just in your head.
Right, exactly. Like,
Yeah, yeah,
and I
yeah,
think it would be easy for it to seem that way because, you know, it's not as if I don't get along with or fit in sort of our a large social group. Like we have plenty of friends and we goes very well and everything, but like I'm very much
yeah,
an anomaly,
yeah,
and I'm fine with that. But yeah, I'm just conscious of all the aspects of a community that are so helpful, especially as a family.
yeah, yeah. No, I think that's really good, and I think a lot of the things you brought up are definitely, I would say, are pretty starkly similar to the same spot I feel myself in. I mean, I think, yeah, that the notion that my daughter might not be able to hold all of these really complex high ways of the tension that I can hold in my head is it's very hubristic to say that that's right. I mean, and this is even the case for my wife. It's like my wife is way more embodied than me. Like even before the pregnancy, like you were mentioning like having the conversations with your wife. Like there's a I've never really been able to do like she has a certain like meter, but as soon as
Yeah.
that meter's exhausted, like it's done. Like whereas I like to me it energizes me. Like I could just go on forever.
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah, yeah,
um
yeah. I've yet
and
to run into a situation where I just can't do
no,
it.
right, exactly, right, right. And so like I mean that's been incredibly helpful for me, kind of entering me into the world and stuff. But like for her, it's like I'll notice it's like if we go and participate in like church or something, or even something like that's like a real manifestation in the world, even if it's like a concert or something like that, like because she actually did it and it was like there were other people there and it was like this thing in the world, like it's real for her. And like for me, like I don't, that's not how I work. Like to me, like it's real because it's real here. And so like whether I went to church or not didn't make it any more real. Like and now, I'm not saying that's
Yeah,
good or bad. That's just
yeah,
the manner by which I participate in the things. But that's not how all people participate. And I might even go as far to say it's not how most people participate.
oh
And
yeah,
that's been a very difficult thing for me to make sense of. Um, because like I don't need to go to church in order to like get that sense of realness. But then as I'm in church and I'm watching other people, that is how they do what I'm doing in my head.
right,
Like, and
right.
that's a
Yeah, yeah,
I,
yeah, yeah,
I don't know how to sort all that out, but I
yeah,
have to at least allow that that's the case to some extent, even if I
yeah,
don't understand it. Um, and so therefore, there is a sense of responsibility I have in offering that, especially to my daughter. And um, yeah, so I mean, we'll see how that goes. I mean, I do think I do think there's a lot of interesting things that happen too. I mean, I know you're mentioning like it is interesting that all of the people bringing in, or most at least, bringing in people to orthodoxy and offering that, no, they're all Protestants from their background. So there's something very unique in which Protestantism plays into the grand scheme of things that we probably won't know, at least in our lifetime. But from a symbolic perspective, it does seem as though Protestantism has acted as a sort of type of thing set against so as to bring people in, whether it was intentional or not. And I think
Yeah.
there's something I'm still drawn to that because in some sense that's how I find myself existing in the
Mm.
world because what you were saying about how you don't want to lose that sense of being having one step on the inside and outside. It's like
Yeah.
I don't people will talk to me about this when I bring up these concerns, people who are more on the inside and they'll talk about how you can still do that from within and sometimes I listen to that and it's like yeah and maybe it's just like my weakness of character or my like I'm too allergic to the cringe that you were kind of pointing out that like maybe I'll get to a point where I don't feel like I have to leave the service, like you said, because
Yeah.
I've reached a higher level of maturity.
Yeah.
But I also don't want to do that if I haven't reached it and try and create this false facade. Like I have to be true to
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's a tension that just exists. And then so I do recognize that that might happen, but like for right now, if that isn't viable, then I have to take the journey that is before me in some sense. And I
Yeah.
do think that involves having kind of a foot on the outside and, navigating that space. But again, I also know, well, that can just be attractive to have those. And so then not everyone can stand on the outside like that. So who am I to say, well, and that's why I would never prescribe that and why I
Yeah.
think it's good that people say like go to church and all like I
Yeah.
would never it's really complicated, and I do think that some of these like TLC symbolic kind of corners are inviting everyone to kind of stand with one foot on the outside, and sometimes I feel like a hypocrite because I also know that can't be how these things hold,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
also don't know what to do with the fact that that's where I am, and so maybe there's so many people that are entering into that space because we're all doing that because we're renewing some tradition. I don't know. I don't know what this looks like, and um,
Well, I think
yeah,
if like how you had gestured before to the idea that for the church to be Christ-like, it has to be consistently dying and resurrecting.
yeah, yeah.
And I think that the way that happens is if the people who are in the church and make up the church maintain a position where they're both within and without,
Mm,
right? Where
yeah.
it's it's harder to understand, I think, at the level of the church, and certainly harder to, well, I guess I don't know, but it seems like it would be harder to live. But I think it's sort of the same thing that we do, like in a marriage, right? Like with my wife, I'm I'm completely in love with her, but because of that, I'm not always, I'm often disagreeing with her,
Yeah, yeah, right,
you
right,
know.
right.
And so I think it's like that, right?
Yeah,
It's like, and that's the thing that of, and it's probably a much bigger fear than I actually need to, like, it feels a lot scarier from the outside, I'm sure, than it probably actually would, because it's not as if I'm going to cease to be myself if I
yeah,
choose to, you know go through catechism and
yeah,
become baptized Orthodox. Like, I'm not gonna just sort of like, you know become
yeah.
immediately an NPC or something, like, you know.
An
But
ortho bro immediately. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's like, that's just, I'm not going to cease being, all the parts of me that are deeply Buddhist are not just going to sort of disappear because of that. Like, I don't think that's going to happen.
Right.
So
There would be some that would think that would be necessary, and that's where part of that
exactly.
tension
Yeah,
becomes. It's
exactly.
like, am I entering into an identity that's hostile to that and doesn't understand that it? I mean, and that's complicated because I also understand where they're coming from. There always has to be that perspective that purity of identity is important.
Yeah.
But then there also has to be the opposing perspective. And again, like you can't ever reduce them. It's the opponent processing that they're mutually affording that I think is key. And I think, it sounds like for you, I like for me, when I became a Christian, I see that as a type of oath that I took,
Mm.
as a type of oath I took to Christ. Whatever it is that means. And I understand that that doesn't have a very embodied aspect in and of itself, but I'm very weary of taking oaths lightly, and because an oath binds you to something,
Yeah.
and it now, and if you understand, like understanding oaths historically, an oath is like a dangerous thing. Like the way we just kind of throw oaths around now is like it was scandalous to take an oath in the ancient world because it was binding.
Yeah.
And the ancient people knew intuitively that the providence of reality would come back and hit you if you didn't get that right.
Yeah.
Um, and so when I took that oath, that put me on a certain trajectory that's seriously. I mean, it's been the source of many of my existential crises, even though it's also been the solution to them. Because it's like I'm now a follower of Christ.
That's
Like I can't.
I love that line.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's like I'm the fault, and I now can't abandon them. And
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
saying that I want to, but now
Right.
it's like now
Yep.
everything is constrained to that. It's the same way with a marriage. It's like now I can't go and pursue everyone, or I
Yeah.
can now I've had a child. Like it's these constraints that you have to afford, but we oftentimes don't talk about how like that's also really scandalous to just say no to all the other things and say
Right.
no this thing. And so now I do believe following Christ offers a particularity that can offer universality, and that's why
Yeah.
I think following him is the only one you can follow in some sense because of
Yeah.
that vision. And that's
Yeah.
where I think really there is a no one comes to the Father except through me if we understand that at the
Well, that's
cosmic
sort of the
level.
trick
But
is you can follow other people, but they're all following Christ anyway.
exactly, right,
Even
right,
if
right.
they're
And
trying
being
not
able
to.
to see that, yeah, yeah, 100%. And so, like, I don't, I'm already bound to this oath that's been problematic for me, to just hold. I don't know if I want to take the next oath and like take an oath to a particular church. Like
Yeah.
like that really weighs on me in the manner by which I see people kind of like just like, well, I'm going to now become a this. It's like you're now bound to that. And so now if reality starts to show you truths that contradict that,
Yeah.
you're now in a bind and there now you have to find a loophole in order to get out of that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's dangerous. That's
Yeah.
really, really dangerous for your soul.
Yeah.
And so I'm, and maybe I will at some point, but it doesn't feel that I'm yet ready to take another oath at maybe like the next level down
Yeah.
because of that problem. And it's a problem that I find it very hard to explicate and help people to understand. But
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
It doesn't. They don't
Yeah.
have to understand it. It is what it is.
Oh yeah. This happens to me, like people just the other day, I lead this wisdom group and a new guy started coming and he has a master's degree in spiritual development or something, right? So he's like, and he was asking me like, do I go to church? And I said, no, and well, why not? And I was
Yeah.
like, well, gosh, like,
Here we go. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
like, oh man. And it's awful because I on one hand, I feel terrible saying, well, it's really complicated because in a sense it's not, but it is. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it's,
No,
yeah, so challenging to actually
I
communicate
totally get it.
clearly.
Yeah.
But I think,
Yeah.
I think you just did a really good job of it there. I think that actually might be one of the better explications of the state because I think it's the same place basically that I've
Mm.
heard of saying, look, I've taken an oath to Christ
Yeah.
and I am so tremendously serious about my own life that that has caused me no end of existential crises and caused
Yeah.
me the solutions of those crises. I think that was very well said.
Yeah. Right. Right.
And also because of that, I am very hesitant to bind myself to a particular way of doing that, of serving
Yeah.
Christ, because
Right.
first of all, I actually don't know which one is the best, and I don't believe I can figure that out. And yeah, it's just
Yeah, right, right. It's like, right. And I do think I maybe will at one point arrive with the same conviction that led me to take the oath for Christ. Because again, I didn't know that either, right?
yeah,
Like at that
yeah,
level. And that I know that through my movement towards particularity, that if that's done in earnest,
yeah.
that even if I choose the wrong, like again, like understand
Yeah, it will be
that
fine. Like
through
Christ
that
will
particularity, through the sin, that it won't matter in the end anyway. Like
exactly.
and that's kind of what's radical about it all.
Yeah, exactly. It's like yeah, love's the most powerful thing in the universe, and Christ will be with you wherever you go. So don't
Right,
like,
right.
again,
Yeah, don't fret about it too much. Like,
it's the tremendous folly of taking your own life so terribly seriously.
yeah.
Like
Right, right.
just
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there's this sense of dreadful seriousness and earnestness that plagues me. That's
Yeah,
why,
yeah.
that something that I value very deeply and attempt to cultivate all the time is the sort of lightness that Lewis often talks about.
Yeah, yeah.
And
And it
and
comes forth also in the way that he writes. He's
dude,
he's just having a grand old time out there. Like,
the last like 4 or 5 months, I've been just I've been spending so much time with Lewis, like a lot,
mm,
and
yeah,
reading a lot of his, I mean, all of his sort of standard stuff, but then a lot of his other like essays and sermons and just, a bunch of things that aren't necessarily his books. And, trying to basically upload him as a dynamic interactive guide.
yeah, right.
And that's been so helpful. Like
Yeah, right.
man,
Like for Vicky's idea of taking the sage and internalizing
yeah,
it
it
through
is.
him.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
right,
That's
right.
exactly what it
Yeah,
is. Yeah, because I've
yeah,
done that with a few people, like that I've done that very specifically with different figures.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, I've been sort of doing it with Lewis, and that's been super, super helpful.
And I think and with Lewis, what Lewis provides is Lewis provides that space that we were just talking about of having taken the oath of Christ, but not maybe the next level. Because Lewis is, not in an explicit sense, and this is why it works so well. He's a bit of an ecumenist.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
he
Oh yeah,
doesn't he doesn't delve into that problem. Like he's
yeah,
just not interested in it. Like
yeah.
it is what it is.
He
I mean,
loves
obviously he's
Christ
an
and he loves the church
yeah,
for what it
right.
is, but he's not interested in
Exactly. In
yeah,
all of his works, whether they be his fiction or his nonfiction, is about taking just an aspect of Christianity that traditionally has been taken for granted and flipping on its head and showing it from all these weird, bizarre angles so that you go, oh, I thought I understood this thing about the tradition that I thought I just had started taking for granted. It's like, oh, I didn't understand this at all, while keeping it like non-heretical, you could say. Like,
yeah,
and
yeah. Oh yeah,
that's brilliant. I mean,
oh
that
yeah,
for him to be able to write such scandalous things about whether the demons and the screw tape letters or hell and the great divorce, it's like he knows the line, but
yeah,
it's all about looking at it from a different angle so
yeah.
that you're brought into a more mystical connection with it, and
Absolutely.
that you don't become kind of apathetic in your way in which you
Yeah, yeah,
encounter
yeah,
with these things.
yeah.
And he does that in all of his books. I mean, he's
Oh
just a
yeah.
master at that.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Well, and he bridges the ancient to the modern. Like that's one of the things
Yeah,
that is so helpful. Like because most of my other sages are ancient,
yeah, right, right, right.
and that is wonderful, and it's problematic because I don't live in the ancient world,
No, right, right, right.
and he, especially in the like in the Ransom series, the his critique and analysis of the modern world is so tremendously helpful.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah.
Um, I'm aware of time. I do need to go
Yeah.
before too long. I'm curious, did we talk up, were there things that you were hoping to talk about that we didn't?
No, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, it's because the level of talking about this sacredness of having children and all of that means is there's almost, it's so like low and embodied that you almost have to kind of jump up to higher levels to understand it. But as long as the conversation is framed, like to me, I mean, it would be interesting if you know if you upload this for people watching, like whether they're like, oh, I thought this was going to be a conversation about like having children, like and like maybe on its surface it didn't look like it went in it, but like for me it was,
Yeah,
but it
yeah,
was
yeah,
that's I can't. There's only a level you can talk about it at that, like the real intimacy. It's the same thing that that Schindler was saying about with like the changing of
yeah,
diapers being the highest, but you don't talk about the changing of like it.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
it's so it's just an act in the world, and it's
yeah,
something you just see and recognize, but it imbues silence, and so I really appreciated framing like us being able to frame the conversation that way and then us kind of taking it in these because
yeah,
I think those all went back and informed that core thing.
yeah,
And so yeah, no, I'm just incredibly grateful because I know, in the conversations that we've had in the past, there's always been this kind of shared similarity about kind of where we exist with the like there's
yeah,
always that's always been
yeah,
something that came from Protestant backgrounds, kind of that kind of thing. And I think and because maybe I don't know, maybe we haven't interacted since Chino. It might be possible. But I knew it, with your children, things have been happening. So
yeah, yeah,
I wanted to just hear how you were doing and
yeah, man.
um,
It's been
just
good to talk to you. Yeah, it has been a
yeah.
little while. And there's one thing that keeps occurring to me that I think is worth saying is, you know, I I had a sort of an insight with the switch to understanding the fundamental ontology of being as relational rather than substance,
Hmm.
with putting that onto the coming into being of children and a family, and recognizing that the ground of the ground of the child's being, and this in part, something that played into this was the at Chino when Paul gave his talk and he did it. He read an excerpt from a book by a guy who was like in maybe he was in law school when his parents got divorced,
Oh
or maybe
yeah,
he
that's
was
right.
or something. But he was sort of working through the existential crisis that his parents' divorce
Mm,
caused for him. And so that's a part of it because what I realize is that the ontological ground of the child is not the parents. It's the marriage, it's their relationship. Like
yeah, which is not a thing in the sense that you can point at it in the world. Right, right. Yeah,
exactly. And it's not me and it's not my wife, right?
no,
And
right.
so that has been really helpful for me. Like that's abstract, but it's very, very practical because it's super helpful for me because what I've learned is that, it's there's a constant balance in life between as a father, I'm finding between being too much my child's friend or being too much their disciplinarian director, right?
Right.
And and your child will tell you when you're on either side of that, right? If you're paying attention.
Yeah,
And
right.
I've tried millions of different angles of how to get better at that because I'm very interested in doing that well.
Yeah, yeah.
But that insight is has been really helpful for me in that because something that is always the right answer when that balance has been thrown off, something that is always the right answer is to make sure I'm loving my wife better than I was yesterday.
Mm,
And
yeah.
because when my children, and it's very like you can just watch it happen, like especially with my daughter now as she's starting to get a little bit more aware and she's watching things and she's
Mm,
when she sees me love my wife and my wife love me in whatever way that looks like in the moment, like you can visibly watch her settle, like you can see her energy settle when that happens.
yeah.
And it's really easy to, I mean, because before you have children you can stand facing each other or you can live facing each other a lot, and then when you
Right.
have children there's a lot of times, like I felt like before we had children it was like this, my wife and I, these are our faces, right? And then
Right.
and then when we had a child and the child's over here we turn like this, right?
Yeah.
We do this sometimes like this. And then you have two children, it's like this, but oftentimes it's going like this, right? Like it's there's a lot of things
Yeah.
happening. And it's not important that you spend a ton of time like this. It's just really important that you come back to it often.
Yes. Yes.
That you do this.
Reestablishing the implicit connection, because even when there's a this or this, whatever's in between, because when you're doing this, it's explicit.
Yeah.
Like, like it's so much more noticeable to read relationality, but there's almost something about this, and then it's still being there, and then even that is almost glorifying the relationality even more so than
Yeah,
this.
exactly. Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think
it
that's
is.
what the child is affording. It's
Yeah.
affording the opportunity for the marriage to mature in its relational reality than it could have ever if there weren't the child present. And that's, man, that's profound.
Yeah, yeah. And if you're, and if your child has a sense that, I mean, the most significant thing I pay attention to is where Ember's energy is, right? If her energy is up and very she's sort of unstable, right? It's like she just needs to find a place where she can settle down.
Mm,
And the more I can feel into and understand how to give her the space that she can settle down, whether she chooses to or not is a different thing. But like if I can trigger that for her when she's up and confused and things are chaotic, it's like, okay, there's a place to settle into. And
mm,
the size of that space. It's something like the size of that space is very, very significantly contributed to by the strength, power, and maybe glory actually is a good term of um the love
mm,
the love in the relationship between my wife and I.
mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That, I mean, that, you said it very well. I think, yeah. I mean, I'll, you know, if we chat again sometime in the foreseeable future, I'll definitely update you on what that looks like, because
Oh
to
yeah.
me it still is existing so much in the imaginal
Oh
space that,
totally.
and I also know no matter what it'll be, it'll blow up whatever the
Oh
conception of
yeah.
it will be.
Oh totally. Yeah. And
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you'll get completely wrecked and it'll be fine.
Right, right. Which might thematically categorize our conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
All
this was
right,
great,
Gage.
man. Thank you so much.
It's been wonderful to see you, man. I always just love getting to talk to you.
Yeah, same here, same here.
Thank you for reaching out.
Yeah, yeah, of course, absolutely. Well, have a great one.
All right, man. Talk to you later.